Hey, good morning, friends, and a happy Palm Sunday. You know, Palm Sunday is the official start of Holy Week, and we are looking forward to some special services here at the Crossing Church beginning this Friday for our Good Friday service at 7 p.m., where we will be together for what will be a more quiet, thoughtful service as we remember the sacrifice of our Lord and share the Lord's Supper together. And then Easter Sunday, we'll be having two services, the first one at 9 a.m. and then the second at 11 a.m. And if you don't have a church home, I hope you would consider joining us for one of our services. And even if the preaching is just okay, you never know, I guarantee the worship time will be heavenly. But this morning at our church, we're having a very special gathering. Even as you hear my words, the service is probably going on if you're listening live. We're having a special baptism service where those who are taking the next step in their obedience to Christ are publicly proclaiming their faith through their own words in what have always proven to be exciting and wonderful personal testimonies. People consider these services to be some of the best we have throughout the entire year. But because, in a sense, our baptismal candidates will be giving the sermon today, we don't have our own regular time of preaching recorded for this week. So instead, we'll be showing a message I gave Palm Sunday last year, which I hope, if you stick around, will be a blessing to you. You'll know right away that it isn't a recently recorded message since I was sporting a beard and still wearing my glasses. That's a dead giveaway. And then after the preaching time, we'll be sharing once again a couple of moving testimonies from our own people here at the Crossing that I know will bless you. So don't leave when I stop talking. Okay, here it is. I'll be back at the very end. Well, you know, sometimes when you look at a scene, a snapshot of life, there's more going on than meets the eye, more than the casual observer a lot of times could understand. Now, sometimes when you look at a snapshot of life, there's things going on that just are hidden from our eyes. They're underneath, they're around. If you had a bigger picture, you'd be able to see them. And then sometimes, you know what, it's not a big deal. It doesn't make that big of an impact if we don't get the full picture on like the price of a gallon of milk. But sometimes what people don't see can make a difference in how they react and in how they live their lives. Sometimes when we don't see the whole picture, it can actually hurt us. And sometimes when our eyes are opened wide to see something glorious, something that, we hadn't seen, it can change us. Something that means we will never be the same again. That happens every now and then. Now, beginning today, we commemorate a very important week in the life of the ministry of Jesus Christ and the life of the calendar of the church. And it's actually a very important week in the history of the planet when you think of it that way. In the short space of a few days, Jesus rode triumphantly into the holy city of Jerusalem, was cheered on by possibly, I think, tens of thousands, uttered some of his most memorable teachings in his entire ministry, and by week's end had endured an illegal trial, unspeakable suffering, death, and then gloriously resurrection. All I can say is, wow, what a difference a week makes. Well, this most incredible week in history began with a short, simple, I like to call it, sweet ride. But that ride, recorded in all four Gospels, by the way, was packed with meaning that the casual reader might not pick up on. There's a bigger picture going on here, and a lot of times people don't see it. But if we pause and we look at that picture a little deeper, we'll be able to see a man who understood his times, who understood himself, who understood where he was going and why he was going where he was going. And when we come to understand those things, when we see the whole picture, it has the capacity to change who we are, how we live, how we relate to others, and consequently, our entire future. So it's a big deal. Now, to understand the context of the passage in Luke chapter 19, we're not going to read the passage. I'm just going to kind of go through a few verses here. And if you have your Bibles, you might want to open them to Luke 19. We need to understand where Jesus had been. He had been journeying from Jericho to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, the Passover was that annual celebration that had been observed for many hundreds of years since Israel's captivity in Egypt, when the angel of death passed over all the homes which had been sprinkled with the blood of a lamb. Now, for the Egyptians, it was a night like no others, as there was wailing and there was mourning literally in every home, as the firstborn males of both men and beast died. The blood of the spotless lamb symbolized what was needed for the forgiveness of personal, family, and national sins. Now, Jesus, along with everyone else in the story in Luke 19, is heading to Jerusalem, like I said. Part of his journey, the last stretch of it, would have taken him through literally the Judean desert. That same desert where just 3 years before, he was not accompanied by thousands, but where he was all alone. And it was there for 40 days and for 40 nights, he fasted and was severely tested by Satan to go another path with his life. Any other path but God's path. Right at the beginning, by the way, of his public ministry. And so here he is again. And I couldn't help but wonder this week as I read the passage, I couldn't help but wonder if he, knowing what was before him, what was awaiting him, was not experiencing some of those same temptations again, wondering if there was another way to fulfill God's destiny, his Father's destiny for his life. You know, sometimes when we know that the right road will be a painful journey, we look for ways out. We look for alternative routes. New, innovative ways to find a shortcut to the goal. But oftentimes, you know what? There is no shortcut. There's no shortcut, for instance, for caring for ailing family members, like an elderly parents, for instance. There really is no shortcut to dealing with the financial mess sometimes we find ourselves in, whether through our own fault or the fault of others, or the fact that we live in a fallen world. And you know what? Stuff just happens. We all get it. And people see us struggling sometimes and, you know, complaining. And sometimes they come to some conclusions about us. They come to conclusions about our situations. But, you know, sometimes they don't have the whole picture. But you know who does? God does. And he is there to offer grace through the valley of the shadow of death that maybe you're going through right now, this morning. Well, Jesus continues on right past, through the desert, right past a town by the name of Bethany. Remember Bethany? Jesus had some really dear friends in Bethany by the names of Mary, Martha. Do you remember the brother's name? Lazarus. They had been with him before, these three, and they were part of his story. As he arrives near Bethany, he remembers what had happened there probably just days before. Lazarus, his dear friend, sister, brother to those dear sisters, was sick, but instead of rushing to their side when he got word that Lazarus was sick, he waits a while longer where he was. And then he receives the word that his friend Lazarus had died. So he picked up and he entered the town where he was met by two grieving sisters who, folks, in all honesty, were a little ticked off that Jesus had not come sooner to heal their brother, especially Mary. I should say especially Martha, but I think they both were. You know, they had given up so much, this family, to follow Jesus, and now their brother was dead. And in their grief and in their questioning, they just hold on tight to Jesus. And then comes the shortest verse in the Bible. It simply reads, Jesus wept. John 11:35. And he wept with them. He wept because of their pain. He wept because of the pain that death brings, not only to them, but to all his children. Because I think he wept because of their unbelief. But he joins in with their sorrow. If you look at that picture in John 11, this is a very, very powerful picture. God is weeping, broken. It is a most extraordinary scene. But you know what? Out of death comes life. And I think a lot of you know the story. He raises Lazarus, returns him to his now overjoyed sisters. Imagine being in the crowd that day. Imagine being those sisters, right? You know, I think verse 37 and the passage in this chapter in Luke is referring to some of those people who were in the crowd that day, people who saw him raise Lazarus from the dead. I think that's what the miracles are referring to. That event was so powerful. And the word went out everywhere, and it kind of swept through the area so quickly that the Pharisees, those who wanted this Jesus movement, stopped in its track, literally plotted to kill the man who had just been raised, Lazarus, since he was a living, breathing, talking demonstration of the power that rested in this man whose ministry they wanted to put an end to. Now, this is all happening before he ever steps foot into the holy city. You need to see what the casual reader may miss. It had all happened just a few days before, and now, he was passing by that village, Bethany, once again. Let me pick up the story in verse 28. It says this: After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And as he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' tell him, 'The Lord needs it.'" We need to see a couple of things here in this bigger picture. The first thing I want you to see is the ride. They're on the backside of the Mount of Olives, and Jesus sends his disciples ahead. They needed a donkey, like I just read. He needed a ride, and he needed an animal to ride on. It was very, very important for him to get this donkey and to ride this donkey, even if his disciples that he sent to fetch it didn't understand that. So they did what he asked them to do, and they find what he said they were going to find, and they bring the donkey to him. And this donkey, by the way, was a donkey that had never been ridden before. It was an animal that had never been sat on. And if you know anything about animals, which I know very little, but this much I do know, that an animal that's never been ridden on before, when somebody jumps on their back, they don't like it very much. I mean, they kind of look around and say, what's going on here, But the animal lets this man on, and this beast of burden has no idea that the passenger, now on his back, would literally be carrying the greatest burden ever bore by anyone, ever. The weight of all the world was resting on this animal. This is very important in the picture. Jesus deliberately gets on the back of this donkey, which would carry him the final leg into Jerusalem and ultimately to death for a reason. He did it for a reason. But Jesus didn't choose this little donkey, for his intelligence. He chose him as a sign. About 500 years before Palm Sunday, a prophet by the name of Zechariah foretold that the Messiah, the one endowed with the power of salvation, would ride into Jerusalem atop a young donkey. The prophet wrote, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Jesus used the donkey to make a blatant and unambiguous statement to the world that he was the long-awaited for Messiah. Jesus wasn't riding into Jerusalem atop a white stallion, swinging a sword like some military conqueror, as almost everyone in the crowd was looking for and hoping that this was the guy. Jesus chose to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, which is a common beast of burden, on an animal that was universally recognized as being symbolic of humility, peace, servanthood, and gentleness. The crowds wanted a conquering king who they could put on a throne. What Jesus wanted was to be willingly enthroned in the hearts of those individuals. Jesus was not coming to bring a short-term political solution to the Roman problem of the first century. He was coming to bring a long-term spiritual solution to a problem that had been shared by all of mankind all through history, which is that our sin and our wrongdoing have separated us from our God. Now, shortly before Jesus got onto that donkey to ride into Jerusalem, he said in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Isaiah wrote, "He bore our iniquities and our sin." I am coming as a servant to give my life as payment for other people. Now think about that for just a minute. The casual observer might not pick up on this stuff. But listen, sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. Look at his ride. It speaks volumes. There's something else that we need to see in this picture. And we need to see the day that Jesus rode that donkey into Jerusalem. As Jesus reached the top of the mount, the city would have come into view, and you would have been able to clearly see the temple. Now, next to the temple was a fortress that housed up to 600 Roman soldiers to keep order, maybe more at that time of year when the population doubled for the celebration. And I can just imagine how charged the air must have been. It must have been electric. What made it more so was the fact that the day he chose to enter the city, a day that we call Palm Sunday, was referred to then as Lamb Selection Day. It was part of the Passover celebration where about 5 days before, people would go and they'd pick out a lamb that their family would then offer as a sacrifice. Now, look, our friends from PETA would have all kinds of problems with this practice. I understand. Why can't you use a stuffed animal, carve that up and maybe get some wine instead of real blood? And look, I know it sounds to most of our ears a little weird, maybe downright cruel, but this is what they understood. They understood something that the casual observer of the scene may miss. That animal was to be sacrificed as a representative of the sins of the family. So it was exciting to choose the lamb. It was exciting for the families to choose the lamb who would, in a sense, kind of bear the sins of the family. Now, could you imagine 100,000 people and more doing the exact same thing on the exact same day? It's like opening up Christmas presents on December 25th, and you're doing it, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and there's thousands of families doing the exact same thing. I don't know, there's something about that. All the noise, all the excitement, all the anticipation, the bartering and the business transactions. You just hear, dad grousing, we paid too much for this lamb. Howard Rubenstein got his for 3 shekels less than what we got paid for. All that conversation is all going on all at once. Now, here's the question. Why do you think that Jesus chose Lamb Selection Day to ride into town. Do you remember when Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, one day, he was with his disciples, they're walking down the road, and Jesus coming the other way, and he saw Jesus walking towards him. Do you remember what he said? He said to his disciples, guys, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Jesus, as declaring himself to be the Lamb of God, he was making himself available to anyone who might choose him that day. See, Jesus choosing that day to ride into town was in effect saying, will you choose me? Will you choose my sacrifice as the one and only sacrifice that can really wash sins away? Will you? Or will you continue in a system that by its very design was to bring you to this point, to this choice, instead of continuing with choosing a way that was not designed to take away sin, but only act as a temporary covering? Are you going to go that way? Or do you want to choose the final sacrifice? You see, a casual observer would totally miss the significance of the day that Jesus rode into town. Folks, sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. But if you miss it, you've missed the whole reason why he came. Something else you need to see in the picture. We need to see the road he traveled on. There was significance in the road he chose to enter town that day. Verse 37 says that Jesus came into the city from the Mount of Olives, from the east side of the city of Jerusalem. Now, this was very, very significant. But again, the significance might be lost on a casual observer. The east, or the Golden Gate, was located in the eastern wall of Jerusalem. It was one of the 11 entrance gates into the city itself. Now, today, that gate is sealed shut. It was sealed up in the 16th century AD, and a cemetery was planted in front of it. Many believe this was done to prevent the entrance of the Jewish Messiah through that gate, as was foretold by known Old Testament prophecies. Jesus entered Jerusalem through the east gate around 30 AD, long before it was blocked by the Ottomans, as he came down from the Mount of Olives and entered the temple, according to our understanding of Luke chapter 19, verses 28 through 48. Now, in Ezekiel 44, in the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, it says concerning this gate that the Messiah will enter it again. Jesus, having entered the city, said that he would not be seen again until Jerusalem acknowledged him. Matthew chapter 23. That is why any devout Jew back then always had one eye fixed to the east, especially in holy days, just in case Messiah would enter. However, one day the Messiah will land on the Mount of Olives with all his saints and will walk down to and then right through the eastern gate into the temple area. Now, you see, a casual observer might totally miss the significance of the gate that Jesus chose to walk through town and walk into town through. Folks, sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. The gate he chose to enter through was not by accident. In all these things, he was signaling the people. He was saying, I am who you've been waiting for. I'm here. But you see, most of them missed it. I've often wondered as I look at people I pass and, whether I'm in the ShopRite or, getting gas in my car or something, I wonder how God has been signaling them. I've wondered at times if my life, if my words, if my testimony might even be used by God in some way to be a signal to others of God's love and his calling out to them. Listen, sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. One more thing, one more piece of the picture that you need to see. We need to see the palms. Although they didn't fully get it, many in the crowd did get that something big was happening here. They didn't know exactly what was happening, but something huge was happening. I'm sure some of them were saying, could this indeed be the Messiah? They had heard about the miracles. Some of them had seen the miracles. So they began to shout, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." You know what they were doing? They were singing an old familiar song taken directly from Psalm 118, which read, "O Lord, save us. O Lord, grant us success. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord, we bless you." And then they did something which the parallel account of this same event in John chapter 12, verse 3 tells us about. They took palm branches and went out to meet him. And they took these and they waved these palm branches around. Why they did wave these as Jesus went through the east gate? Why did they? Was it because they couldn't find any foliage to wave? No, that's not the answer at all. This was a deliberate statement that many in the crowd were making. Palm branches were a symbol for the nation of Israel, of their freedom, of their independence. Many years before, when they were a free nation, archaeologists have found coins and the images stamped on coins, that of palm branches. It represented to them national pride, national freedom. And symbols don't need an explanation. The people who understand them know what they mean. And when they picked up palm branches and they waved them before Jesus, they were saying to the Romans, "This is our King. He will bring us freedom. He will bring us back our independence that you took from us." It was a sign, literally, of rebellion. They shouted, "Hosanna," which means, "Save us now." And the Pharisees, the leaders, they understood exactly what was going on here. Because in verse 39, they said, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples. Tell them to stop. You want to get us all killed? Now, we don't like the Romans any more than you do, but let's stop with the suicide wish, shall we?" And Jesus answered them in verse 40, and he says this, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. I am the King." You don't believe it? Most of them didn't understand it really. They didn't even understand what they were saying, but it was true. It was true nonetheless. What they were saying was right, Jesus was saying. It is appropriate. In fact, it's the most appropriate thing to do. For them to worship anyone or anything else would be most inappropriate. And so now you have Jesus leading this parade, seated on a donkey, marching toward the east gate, down the main road from the Mount of Olives on a lamb on Selection Day, with people beginning to wave palm branches and shouting out, "Hosanna, save us now," shouting out praise. And then something happens. Something happens which, above everything else, speaks to the heart of the human predicament and the frustration brought on by the blindness that sin causes. Because we read in verse 41, "As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it." He wept over the city. And the words that are used there don't mean that he shed a little tear at the corner of his eye. There's a little moisture in the corner of his eye. Peter walks over with a little tissue and says, "Jesus, I think you got something, maybe a little dust in your eye," and just it wasn't that. It literally means, the language literally means that he was sobbing. He was wailing. Have you ever sobbed over something? Maybe over a great loss. I remember as a kid, A child in our neighborhood, my friend's sister, had been run over by a school bus, was killed one Friday afternoon. I'll never forget. In fact, it was on a Good Friday. And as I ran toward the commotion, and I was a little boy, a neighbor's mother ran towards my sister and I, who were running towards the commotion, and said, "No, run home, go home, don't come this way." And all I could see under her waving arms was a blanket over a body, and my friend's mother, the mother of that little girl, sobbing, wailing, making sounds that I had never heard before, that only one who had suffered indescribable loss could ever utter. So why in the world would Jesus be crying like that? If there was a picture of what could be considered the best of times for Jesus, listen, folks, this is it. I mean, he's going into the city. He's been carried into the city on a wave of messianic expectation and excitement. But you know, this entry was not a pleasant one for Jesus at all. Not only does he know the pain that lies ahead for him personally, but he also knows that he's not going to be the only one suffering. See, the entire nation, in a short time, will make a frightful choice. They will reject their only hope. They will miss the day of God's visitation, and the consequences were going to be dire. Verse 32 says, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." A major opportunity had been missed. If they had known it, they would have been blessed. But they just didn't see the whole picture. You know, sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes the judgment of God on Jerusalem in great detail in his writings. The Roman Emperor Titus overran the city after a long encirclement of the city in 70 AD, killing or capturing almost everyone within its walls. There was near total destruction and total slaughter. Their Messiah had come, and they had rejected him. And so Jesus weeps. He wails. He wails for the suffering, because they had turned down an opportunity to be reconciled to God. The choice was theirs to make. It's a choice that we must make. The Bible says that there will be judgment for everyone who rejects God's way of salvation. And it will be real and inevitable and painful and tragic and eternal. But listen, Jesus came so that the day of judgment would never come near you or near me, because he was judged at Calvary by God for our sin. He drank the cup of God's wrath against sin to the very bottom. And now forgiveness is there. But the choice is yours. The whole picture is this: Jesus came, he died, he was buried, and he rose again, so that we might have life. You know, the thief on the cross alongside Jesus never got baptized, never joined the church. He never gave a dime to missions. He just looked to Jesus and said, "Remember me." And he did. And our good God received him that very day. You know, sometimes when you look at a scene, a snapshot of life, there's more going on than a mere casual observer would even understand. Sometimes what people don't see can greatly impact their lives. Open your eyes to the goodness of our God today. We need to see. We need to understand. And when and if we do, it will forever impact our lives, beginning right now and continuing for all eternity.
So I'm Esther Alabi. We started coming to the Crossing Church 23 years ago. Like I said, I grew up in church, but growing up in church is not the same as having that personal relationship. I've heard messages, I've seen movies about, sin and salvation, heaven and hell, things like that. And I've always tried to, make good choices, but no one is perfect. We've always said that. Before, like I said, I try to do things right. And every mistake I made, I was scared, like, God is angry. Most of my good choices was not to disappoint God and my parents. At the same time, I knew deep down I was seeking, but I thought I was getting it right. However, January 20th, 1990 was a turning point for me. That day, I heard this message that kind of really resonated with me. The pastor was talking about the final moments of some people who trusted in Christ. For me, I was like, okay, so if people can feel so much at peace, knowing they're transitioning, like they're not going to be here anymore, that's something I want to happen to me. I want to live a life that when the time comes, I'll be ready, I'll be at peace, and that settled it for me. Having Christ in my life changed me in a way, and it's still changing me because I'm still a work in progress like everyone else. It's changing me in the sense that I know that God loves me deeply, better than I could ever love myself, and that He's there. Of course, life has not been, it's a roller coaster for everybody. Hard times come, good times come, but He's the God of the mountains and the valleys. I like the word of Jesus where He says, in this life you have troubles, you have tribulations, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Knowing that the word overcomer is with me, that's amazing. So in hard times, yeah, I'll cry sometimes when things are tough, but at the same time, at the back of my mind, I know that He has a plan. My cries have a purpose. My pains have, they come along with His plan. He's working all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. I know I didn't call Him, He called me. He chose me, and He has that good plan. As I walk with God, things are not always going to be the way that I plan it, but God is so sovereign. He's so, He has everything under control, and He knows how much we can bear because He's handling everything else, and He takes us one step after the other. So that's what I'm learning, growing to trust more in His decision, in His plan, in His purpose, and taking a step of faith. I never dreamt that I would live in America. I never saw myself living outside of Nigeria. When I met my husband, I met him through a friend who I worked with. And when the guy told me, he has a friend from America, I'm like, that's it. No, we're not talking about it. I'm not talking to, I'll say hi, but that would be it. But I met my husband, and we talked, and I was like, no. So, well, one thing led to the other. Here I am. And I actually moved here in 1997. And God has been faithful because, like I said, things don't always work the way we planned it. So that's one big thing. That's a life-changing thing for me. But working with Christ, we can't always see everything. So we just need to trust Him. So that's one thing I've learned, and I'm still learning. In 2006, I got laid off where I was working, and I didn't understand it. But God had a plan, because I got laid off end of June, and my father passed in July. And if I was still working, I may not have been able to have the time to go for his funeral. In the hindsight, I was like, wow, I felt bad being laid off, but God had a plan because He wanted to give me that opportunity, to go. And a few months after, I got another job. Surprisingly to me, but not to God, and knowing that He's able to do all things. But at the end of the day, I can always look back and see His hand, His fingerprint on everything. I know that God has a purpose for every single thing that happens. God is still working on me, overcoming my fears. Wednesday was 16 years ago that I lost my younger sister. That happened in Nigeria. It was in a car crash. For quite a while after she passed, I had months of panic attack. It was sudden, and I didn't realize how much it affected me until I'll be driving, and every time I saw a slope, I'll freeze. And little by little, God helped me through. God has been faithful through it all. God is in control. He has everything planned out. Nothing happens without His knowledge, without His permission. And He will always see us through, regardless of how bad it is. If it's not God's time, you can't force it. If it's God's time, you can't stop it. I'm learning to let Him just, override whatever my initial plan is, because ultimately He has the best plan. Whatever decision we make, even when things don't go our way, it's all because He has something better. Because I think of Jesus. Jesus Himself said, Father, let this cup pass from me. But then he said, not my will, but your will. He knew why He came, right? He knew His purpose. But He got to that point where He saw the whole thing. And the Father kind of, it was like, this is the moment. But at the same time, He still trusted in the will of the Father. He has the perfect plan.
So I'm Amanda.
And I'm Rob. And we've been coming to the crossing for about a year and a half.
I was, I think, just about 7 months pregnant. I was leaving work and I fell. And I hit my knees first and then my belly. But I freaked out and I was crying and I called him and I'm like, it definitely hit my belly. I don't know if she's okay. I'm gonna go get looked at. So I went to the doctor, got a scan, she was fine. I kept feeling like something wasn't right. I started feeling like sharp pains. I went to the bathroom and found out I was bleeding. A friend of mine that had unfortunately been through the same thing, she canceled my day at work, took me to the hospital, called my husband.
And you're like, they're just gonna check things out. Everything's okay, don't leave work, everything's fine. Because you were fine.
The doctors actually did say, we can't figure out where the bleeding's coming from.
Yeah.
So you might be able to go home. We just need to figure out where it's coming from. Everything else looks good. She looks great. But I think I called you because I started actually having contractions.
And so she starts having contractions, and I talked to her friend who was like, hey, Amanda's having a hard time communicating this right now, but they're giving her medicine to slow the contractions and hopefully stop them. Leave work if you can. I'm like, all right, let me just talk to her. And she's like, go home, get the bag of clothes, get the car seat. I'm like, we don't need this stuff because we're not having a baby. It was like, in my mind, we weren't having a baby. It was like, not that she was overreacting, but like, hey, the doctors were in control. They're gonna give her some medicine. Everything was gonna be fine. The doctors didn't believe we were having the baby either. It's our understanding at that time. But just in case, we need to give you XYZ medications to expedite the development of your child.
7 months is not enough to be born. Your baby's underdeveloped. So I got steroids to develop her lungs and her brain a little faster.
But specifically, they were giving her magnesium to slow the contractions, hopefully to completely stop them.
Yeah, it was miserable. It literally makes your body burn. So that was 2 whole days of that.
She woke me up in the middle of the night in the hospital because I was sleeping on the chair next to her, and said she was having contractions again.
They asked if I wanted morphine instead for like pain. And I'm like, you're not understanding. I'm gonna have this baby. Like, I know what this feels like. I had a baby only less than a year ago. Like, I'm definitely having this baby.
And I'm saying you're not having the baby. This whole time, like,
And I'm
like, you're not having the baby.
I need an
The baby's
epidural.
not due yet. The next morning, they start the medication. They're like, your OBGYN is gonna be in the hospital at 7 o'clock. So at 7 o'clock, he'll come and see you. He comes in, he's talking to us, hey, Dad, how you doing? I'm like, my back, it's sore from sleeping on the chair. Don't worry about me, how about my wife? He looks at her and he goes, okay, let me have a look. He moves the gown and he goes, okay, I just broke your water, we're having a baby today. And I'm like, we weren't having a baby today. We weren't having a baby tomorrow, we're not having this baby. So at that point, I was like, oh gosh, we're having this baby.
Because she was small enough, my doctor can't advise me to, but he offered to push. So he was like, you can, or you can do the C-section, but if you push, you have the possibility of your uterus rupturing, which is dangerous to me and the baby. So now I'm sitting there and I'm like, okay, my baby's coming 2 months early, and I have to decide the safest way for my baby to come out. Like, that's heavy.
Yeah.
I started crying hysterically. I'm like, I don't know how to make the right decision. I'm like, I don't know. So he was great. He was the level-headed, calm one, and prayed over us and was like, you can definitely push this baby out. It's easier. You can do this. She came very fast. It was very easy, the delivery, and very beautiful. But then they were taking her away, obviously. She couldn't be with us, so.
They gave you Charlie for a second. Like, you held her for 1 second, and then they were like, okay, things aren't going right. Our daughter was tiny. She was,
Unimaginably small.
they said 3 pounds, but we think she was under 3 pounds. So I'm watching what's happening, and then she's like, is everything okay? And of course I have to say everything's okay, because you can't be like, no, she's blue, right? And they're acting like they're not freaking out, but they're holding her upside down and shaking her like this isn't what's supposed to happen. They rushed her off to the NICU, and then we're just in a room like, what just happened, and where'd the baby go? She looked like she was in a spaceship. She was intubated, she had IVs, her eyes are covered, she was completely
Her eyes
wrapped
were
up.
shut.
She
like,
had,
literally,
they
because in the
taped,
womb, they don't open for however many weeks after, like, she wasn't past that point.
yeah,
Her skin was see-through.
yeah,
She had an
transparent
infection,
skin.
so whatever made me bleed, which they still have no idea.
So immediately she gets a spinal tap, which isn't, we're getting serious right away.
Blood transfusions.
Well, transfusions on, a daily basis. Day after day was bad news. It wasn't like, hey, we had a tough delivery, but in 3 days everything's gonna be okay. It was
40 days.
on day on day 12. They're like, her infection's getting worse. If this doesn't stop it, we're gonna start experimental treatments. But in the meantime, everybody's calling us like, congratulations, you've had this baby. Send me a picture. Where's your chest to chest? The skin to skin picture you see people have. I didn't have that with either of my kids, and neither did my wife. It got to the point it was too painful for both of us to even tell our parents. Every time my mom would call, we'd just be like, she's having a tough time. Just keep praying for us, because that is all I probably could physically say without, you know.
Breaking down. I knew she wasn't coming home with us. She was gonna have a lot of issues, and she did. I got 2 hours with my daughter a day. That's for 40 days. Usually that's like the joyful time that people get with a baby. So after everything, I had PTSD for several months after. It was tough.
We determined that I would go before work, so every day I went like 4 o'clock in the morning, spent a couple hours with her. Like I wasn't able to hold her for 3 weeks, so it was like I'd have to sanitize my hands and wash my hands 5 times to stick a finger in to touch through a blanket, and it was like we didn't have answers. We had another child that we had to be 100% there for, and we had a child in the hospital that we had to leave.
Trauma does weird things, and he was stressed separate from how I was stressed. So we were very disconnected during that, when we should have been more together. But like trauma, you don't know how somebody handles until you're in it, so. But I think we're better and closer for it. I don't know, like during it, we weren't our strongest, but I definitely think we've come way closer.
For sure. To leave the NICU, they do the seatbelt check, or a car seat check. So they put the baby in a car seat and monitor their breathing for like an hour. They try doing that pretty early, so we get excited every time. We're like, this might be it. Because in my mind, I'm like, if they're letting us go, we're good. So we, like 2 weeks in, we do this seatbelt or car seat check, and
She failed.
She bombed it.
And I was like, so we're not going home? It was like discouraging after one thing after the next.
But she started doing better. She did, for sure.
The nurse, she was like, I think she might be able to go home tomorrow. And we were like, what? We got so excited. We didn't tell any family. We got everything ready. Like, I don't know. We went in that day and I asked my parents to come over and I was like, please watch Robbie. I think she's coming home today. I was a nervous mess. She came home at 5 pounds.
Yeah.
Some babies are born at 5 pounds, but that's small. Yeah. She was a month and a half old.
Yeah.
I always was checking to see if she was breathing. I did that with my son too, but for obvious reasons now, I'm like, how am I gonna know? But they also trained her really well in the NICU that she was like on a schedule and doing really well. So it was a very easy transition. I think just because we wanted her home, it was easier to have her home than juggle an at-home life that's separate from a hospital life. We came out of it and she's brilliant. She's not behind in anything. She saw a high-risk doctor for the last 2 years, and we had our last one in February for her turning 2, and she's off the charts. I mean, if you've seen Charlie, she's sassy, but she's smart. She's the best. She's a little miracle.
Charlie truly was a miracle. And I should say, she is a miracle, because even doctors throughout the whole process was like, you shouldn't be where you are. She shouldn't be where she is. The 2-year doctor visit with the high-risk doctor, he said, I've never seen this before. We went from not knowing what was gonna happen next to an expert saying, I've never seen this before. And that's a miracle. And we're forever thankful to God for it. I think we get more praying fathers in this world on their knees begging for God's mercy for their children, and this world's gonna be a different place. I really, truly believe that.
If there was a limit on praying, I definitely went way over it. I think I became more into my faith after Charlie, for sure.
We drew near to God.
Yeah.
There is no debate about that.
And our kids love Jesus too.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
They're pretty cute.
But it emphasized God's goodness to us. Even though it felt like it was our world was closing in, and it was getting dark, and it was like, but hindsight, it's like all this terrible stuff happened, but there was so much beauty in it. It was family relationships are strengthened, friendships are strengthened. We met nurses that we're friends with and doctors that we're friends with to this day. And that God is there. And it's not like we weren't just, crying to ourselves in our sleep. And I feel like it matured us,
Good. I agree.
in our faith. I'm still immature.
Aren't we all?
Well, thanks so much for watching this morning. Again, please join us for our Good Friday service this Friday evening, 7 p.m. And then again, Sunday morning, Resurrection Sunday morning at either the 9 a.m. or the 11 a.m. service for what I know will prove to be an incredible time of praise and worship. Although there will be no childcare for our Good Friday service, we will be offering it for children 5 years old and under at both Sunday services. Hope